Did you know there used to be a tiny kingdom hidden deep in the Himalayas, surrounded by the towering presence of India, China, Nepal, and Bhutan? It wasn't a legendary place in a fairy tale, it was real. And until 1975, it had its own king, its own flag, its own borders, and even its own foreign policy. That kingdom was Sikkim. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, come join us. Nestled between some of the most powerful nations on Earth, Sikkim was a land of towering mountains, misty valleys, and deep-rooted Buddhist tradition. It was one of the smallest countries in Asia, barely the size of a dot on a map. But for over 300 years, it survived through diplomacy, religion, and remarkable geographic isolation. But how did a place so small remain independent for so long? Sikkim wasn't just a buffer state, it was a spiritual stronghold, a kingdom rooted in Tibetan Buddhism, where the monarch, called the Chogyal, was seen not only as a ruler, but as a Dharma king, a protector of the faith. And yet today, most people don't even know that Sikkim was once a country. Search for it now, and you'll find it listed as just another state in India, one of the smallest, least talked about, and most mysterious. So what happened to it? How did a sovereign kingdom disappear from the map in just one generation? To understand that, we need to go back in time to trace the birth of this mountain kingdom, its rise under the Chogyal dynasty, and its dramatic fall into the hands of geopolitics, revolution, and modern power struggles. The history of the Kingdom of Sikkim begins with a mysterious monk in exile. In the year 1642, a Tibetan Lama named Phuntsog Namgyal was crowned in a sacred ceremony, chosen by local lamas and tribal leaders to become the first Chogyal, the Dharma king of Sikkim. This marked the official birth of the Sikkimese monarchy, a kingdom founded on Tibetan Buddhism, where political authority and spiritual leadership were deeply intertwined. But Sikkim wasn't a homogeneous state. It was a mosaic of three major ethnic groups: the Tibetan nobility, including the royal family, the Lepchas, who were the original inhabitants of the region, and the Nepali settlers, who would arrive in large numbers in later centuries. The Lepchas regarded the land as sacred and lived in harmony with the mountains and forests. The Tibetan ruling elite, especially the Chogyal dynasty, saw themselves as protectors of the faith, continuing the legacy of Buddhist kingship from the Tibetan highlands. Meanwhile, the Nepalis, skilled in farming and trade, would gradually rise in population and economic influence, planting the seeds for future ethnic tensions. The Sikkimese kings ruled with a unique ideology. The Chogyal was not merely a king, but a spiritual guardian, a living symbol of Buddhist authority. This turned Sikkim into a buffer state of Buddhist theocracy, positioned delicately between Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal. The monarchy was hereditary, passed down through the Namgyal royal family. Their legitimacy wasn't just political, it was believed to be divinely ordained. Support from the monastic elite was essential, and the capital was eventually established in Gangtok, now the capital of India's Sikkim state. The royal palaces combined the architectural styles of Tibetan monasteries and Himalayan mountain homes, creating a distinctly isolated, mystical atmosphere. But here's the thing. That same spiritual political structure that helped Sikkim survive for centuries also made it extremely fragile in the face of outside change. When colonial forces began moving across the Himalayas in the 19th century, Sikkim's quiet kingdom would soon find itself entangled in the great geopolitical games of the British Empire. By the 19th century, Sikkim was standing at a crossroads, one that would change its destiny forever. As the British Empire extended its reach into the Himalayan foothills, the tiny Buddhist kingdom of Sikkim was drawn into a geopolitical struggle far beyond its control. The British had one clear goal: gain control of the mountain passes and secure trade routes into Tibet. In 1817, Sikkim signed the Treaty of Titalia with British India. From that point on, Sikkim became a protectorate. Officially, it retained its monarchy and internal autonomy. But in reality, Britain now held authority over its foreign policy, defence, and territorial disputes, marking the beginning of the end for Sikkim's true independence. However, Sikkim's relationship with the British wasn't always smooth. In the mid-1800s, tensions escalated when the Sikkimese attempted to block British expeditions from entering Tibet. The British responded with force, sending troops into Sikkim and compelling the kingdom to sign a series of increasingly one-sided treaties. The most significant of these was the Treaty of Tumlong in 1861, which drastically reduced the power of the Chogyal and established a permanent British political officer in Gangtok. Despite the loss of sovereignty, the British did leave behind a visible footprint. They constructed parts of the Himalayan railway system, introduced Western-style schools, and laid the foundations for a more modern bureaucratic system. For the Chogyals, this era was a tightrope walk, preserving tradition on one side while accommodating imperial oversight on the other. But one thing was certain: the balance of power was shifting, and it wouldn't be long before Sikkim's royal lineage would face a far more irreversible fate. By the mid-20th century, Sikkim appeared peaceful on the surface, but beneath that calm tension was quietly building. After India gained independence in 1947, New Delhi inherited Sikkim's protectorate status from the British. But the Indian government had no intention of remaining a passive guardian. At first, India promised to honour Sikkim's autonomy, but over time it began to place military outposts, interfere in foreign affairs, and exert growing influence over Sikkim's internal politics. Inside the kingdom, tensions were also rising. The ethnic composition had shifted. Nepali-speaking residents now made up the majority, surpassing the Lepchas and Tibetan-descended elites. Yet they remained underrepresented in government, land ownership, and education. Then came 1973, a year that changed everything. Mass protests erupted across the kingdom. Led by Nepalese-origin democratic activists, the protests accused the royal family of election rigging and ethnic oppression. Chaos broke out near the royal palace, and Indian troops entered Sikkim, officially to restore order, but in reality they were taking control. The Chogyal, Palden Thondup Namgyal, tried to remain neutral, but it was too late. A provisional government was installed under Indian supervision, while the king himself was gradually stripped of all authority and eventually placed under house arrest. Then came the 1975 referendum, orchestrated by India. Voters were asked a single question: do you support Sikkim becoming a state of India? India claimed that over 97% voted yes. But historians and critics argue that this was a deeply manipulated process, conducted under military occupation, with no transparency and no real opposition. That same year, the Indian Parliament passed legislation officially annexing Sikkim as India's 22nd state. The Kingdom of Sikkim, its flag, its monarchy, its identity, vanished from the world stage overnight. This wasn't just a historical transition, it was a quiet absorption of a once independent kingdom. After 1975, Sikkim was officially recognized as the 22nd state of India. This once spiritual Himalayan kingdom, ruled by monarchs, guarded by mountains, and steeped in Buddhist tradition, was now part of the world's largest democracy. Administratively, Sikkim was granted a legislative assembly and an elected chief minister. Infrastructure gradually improved. Roads were built, schools established, hospitals funded. India poured investment into the region, accelerating modernization while tightening control over this strategically important border state. But for many Sikkimese, this modernization came at a cost. They had lost their sovereignty, their royal lineage, and for some, even their sense of identity. The last king of Sikkim, Palden Thondup Namgyal, was dethroned and eventually moved to Darjeeling. He spent his later years in exile in the United States, where he died in New York in 2003 at the age of 63. His wife, Hope Cook, an American woman once seen as a symbol of Sikkim's modern future, left the country following political turmoil and eventually divorced the king. While the royal family's descendants still exist, they now serve only as cultural symbols with no political role. Though India pledged to protect Sikkim's religious and cultural heritage, in practice, many traditions began to fade. Tibetan language education, lecture ceremonies, and Buddhist rituals were slowly marginalized. Younger generations began to assimilate into broader Indian society, and the memory of a once sovereign kingdom began to blur. To this day, some older Sikkimese residents still insist we were annexed, not integrated. In places like Nepal and Dharamshala, small exile communities and independence groups still exist. They may have little political impact, but they are proof that this chapter of history has not yet been fully closed. Sikkim didn't fall in a war. It fell silently through signatures, ballots, and shifting allegiances. What disappeared wasn't just a flag, but a living identity. Sikkim's story isn't just the fall of a small Himalayan kingdom, it's a modern parable, a quiet yet powerful lesson on what it means to be small in a world ruled by giants. There were no bombs, no invasions, no colonial conquest. Instead, it vanished through paperwork, referendums, and silence. And perhaps that's what makes it so unsettling. Sikkim teaches us that independence is not just about flags and anthems. It requires the strategic capacity and political leverage to stand firm against external pressure. Culture and religion may shape identity, but without real power to protect them, identity itself can be diluted or erased. And most striking of all, international silence is itself a choice. When Sikkim held its referendum, no global powers stepped in. When the king cried out for help, no one truly responded. That's the vulnerability of small nations. When you're neither powerful nor essential, you may not even have the right to be noticed. So how did other countries react to India's annexation of Sikkim? Bhutan, a fellow Himalayan Buddhist kingdom, took the lessons seriously. It tightened control over its borders, refused to host Indian troops on its soil, and fiercely guarded its diplomatic independence to avoid Sikkim's fate. Nepal maintained a formal silence, but many nationalists criticized India's intervention and used the moment to deepen ties with China, seeking to counterbalance India's growing Himalayan influence. The Tibetan exile government found itself in a delicate position. Culturally close to Sikkim, but politically dependent on India, it made no public statement, underscoring its precarious status. The Chinese government officially condemned the annexation. For years, China refused to recognize Sikkim as part of India, and only indirectly acknowledged it in a 2003 border agreement, a decision that continues to fuel tension along the China-India border. The long-term impact. It solidified India's strategic presence between Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet. It altered the power dynamics in the Himalayas and intensified border frictions. And perhaps most of all, it sent a clear message to small nations worldwide. Protection from a big neighbor can become domination unless you have your own leverage. Even today, across the world, there are places just like Sikkim, quiet corners of culture, faith, and identity, struggling to survive between competing powers. And Sikkim's story stands as a mirror, reminding us not all countries fall in war. Some fade into history with no sound at all. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a forgotten corner of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. More global stories and hidden truths are on the way. See you in the next video.